shift to foreign policy here. Congressman, you've said you think there is no more practical military goal for Israel and that it can achieve in Gaza. As a U.S. Senator, though, how would you hold Hamas accountable for the worst terrorist attack in Israeli history back on October 7th of 2023? And what military approach would you like to see Israel take at this point in its war?
Yeah. Well, let's begin at the beginning. October 7th was a horrific terrorist attack by a terrorist organization in Hamas, the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. They bear the responsibility for this war. This is a war of choice by them. And Israel has a right to defend itself, and I have always stood up for their right to defend themselves. I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I've been on it for the last 6 years, and I was in Israel not long before the attack happened. I visited a kibbutz along the Gaza border called Kfar Asa. While I was there, we shared a meal, and we were also FaceTiming with a Palestinian man in Gaza City who was a father of 4, talking about strengthening ties between Palestinians and Israelis. Kfar Asa on October 7th was the site of what an Israeli general called a massacre. And I don't know what's happened to that father of 4. But I can tell you this, folks on both sides of that fence deserve to have a future, one that's free of this cycle of violence. It's time for us to reach a negotiated settlement to bring the hostages home, to also bring the remains, unfortunately, of the ones who have died in captivity. Hamas must be held accountable, and they will. According to the Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, they are no longer in a position to be able to pursue an October 7th style attack. But let's also be very clear. There was a vote in the United States Congress to provide aid to Israel, to provide aid to Ukraine, to Taiwan, to help with the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I voted for it. Senator Cornyn voted for it. Ted Cruz voted against it. You can't say that you are for supporting Israel and their right to defend themselves when you vote against that critical funding.
Congressman, thank you. Senator, same question for you. What military approach would you like to see Israel take at this point? Multiple fronts are opened up right now.
Well, thank you, Jason. I will say this issue is one of the clearest differences between Congressman Allred's record and my record. When I was elected 12 years ago, I resolved then to be the leading defender of Israel in the United States Senate. And I've worked every day to do that, to stand up and fight to support Israel. I am proud to stand with Israel. Our position should be that America stands unshakably with Israel. When President Trump was president, I urged him to move our embassy to Jerusalem. He did, and I was there the day we opened the embassy in Jerusalem, and I've never seen such celebration. When President Trump was president, I urged him to pull out of the disastrous Iran nuclear deal. He did, and it was the single most important national security decision of his entire presidency. Congressman Allred has consistently lined up against Israel. At the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, he urged them to send money to Gaza, even though it would go to Hamas. He has supported Kamala Harris and Joe Biden flowing over $100 billion to Iran. 90% of the funding for Hamas and Hezbollah comes from Iran. I'll tell you, Congressman Allred invited a radical imam here in Dallas who calls Zionists monsters and has compared them to Nazis. Congressman Allred calls them the very best of North Texas. I don't support those who engage in anti-Semitic actions, and I will tell you the funders of the anti-Semitic protest on college campuses are among Congressman Allred's biggest supporters. We need clarity. We need to draw a line, and as for me and my home, we will stand with Israel.
Senator, thank you for that. Congressman, you have 60 seconds.
We have to talk about this because there was a vote. It's not about talking. It's about action. We had a vote in the United States Congress to provide military funding and aid to Israel, to Ukraine, to Taiwan, to address the humanitarian issues in Gaza and around the world. Part of that aid package was $5 billion in the interceptors that were used in the Iron Dome to prevent the Iranian rockets that just rained down on Israel a couple of weeks ago. That happened in spite of Senator Cruz. It was a very illuminating vote because the extremists were the ones who voted against it. The far left voted against it. The far right voted against it. I think there was only 18 senators who voted against it. And Ted Cruz was one of them. So you can't tell me that you support Israel when the rubber meets the road and you're not there. But let's also be very clear. We have to find a negotiated diplomatic settlement to many of these issues. And that is what I'm going to try and contribute to when I'm in the United States Senate.
So I need 60 seconds to respond to that charge there. Now,
did you vote for it?
Well, let's actually get into it.
You voted against it.
So Congressman Allred is right that there was a bill that was on the floor of the Senate, and I opposed that bill. Why? Because I said at the time that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to flow money to Gaza and give it to Hamas, but they're going to freeze weapons to Israel. That's exactly what they did. And after that, the House of Representatives took up a bill to provide emergency weapons to Israel, and Congressman Allred voted no. Understand, every single time Congressman Allred, right now in this debate, he is echoing the calls of the enemies of Israel saying, ceasefire now. He claims there is nothing else to be done militarily. I'll tell you, when Israel detonated the pagers against Hezbollah, it was one of the most targeted and effective military actions we have ever seen. Congressman Allred is proud to be supported by J Street, the radical left organization that undermines Israel at every level. And I got to say, listen, that's dangerous. Right now, Kamala Harris and Colin Allred both want the votes of the anti-Semites on college campuses. I don't want their vote. And if they threaten Jewish students, they should be arrested. They should be prosecuted. They should be expelled.
Senator,
and if they're from another country, they should be deported.
Senator, that's your time. But let's stay right here. As you mentioned, you have been a strong advocate of Israel's right to defend itself. But the World Court has found it plausible that Israel has committed acts that violate the Genocide Convention. Do you think Israel bears any responsibility for the civilian deaths and humanitarian crisis in Gaza? You have 90 seconds.
I think there is no country on earth that fights a more humane, a more targeted, a more just war than the people of Israel. The World Court and the International Court of Justice is filled with anti-Semites. They repeatedly attack Israel over and over and over again. And I'll tell you, I've got real experience there. When I was the Solicitor General of Texas, I represented the state of Texas before the U.S. Supreme Court fighting against the World Court, and we won a 6-3 victory because the World Court was trying to attack Texas just like it's trying to attack Israel. Listen, Israel goes in, number one, it deliberately targets military targets. I mentioned the pagers before. I've never seen a military action that was actually the leadership of Hezbollah who decided who would get these pagers. And you had to be just enough of a psychopathic terrorist that Hezbollah wanted you on that pager. That's who detonated. It was precisely targeted. You know, Israel, when they go in, when they see, for example, military operations in a building, they send text to all the civilians there. They drop leaflets. They drop what's called a knock bomb on the top that just makes a noise to tell civilians clear out. There's no other nation that goes to the steps it does to avoid civilian casualties. You know who's responsible for the civilian deaths? Hamas, because they use human shields. And let's talk about records. I introduced legislation to sanction Hamas for using human shields. That legislation passed into law. It is one of the 101 different pieces of legislation I've enacted, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris refuse to enforce that law. They will not sanction Hamas, and Congressman Allred will not stand up to them.
That's your time. Congressman, does Israel bear any responsibility for civilian deaths and a humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
Well, listen, I will agree with Senator Cruz that Hamas is a terrorist organization that hides amongst the civilian populace. This is part of their battle plan. They anticipate and want civilian casualties. They put their tunnels beneath playgrounds, beneath elementary schools. They do this knowing that they make it more difficult to then target them without it causing civilian casualties. No one in Texas or across the country should shed any tears for Hamas. What we can do at the same time is have within our hearts the capacity to say that we want to prevent unneeded civilian suffering. And that is something that I've always believed, that we can separate, and we've done this our entire history as a country. This is what makes us great. It's what also makes democracies like Israel great, is that we can separate the terrorist leaders of a group from the people who are being subjected to that. And so, to me, what we have had to keep our focus on is trying to provide as much aid as possible to innocent civilians in Gaza, to make sure that children are not being unnecessarily targeted. This has to be our responsibility. This has to be the Israeli responsibility. And that's something that I'll continue to work on in the Senate when I have a chance.
All right. Thanks, Congressman.
Do I get 60 seconds?
Yes, that's.
We're
going to move on to.
Senator, we have.
I thought it was 96.
Yeah.
This is. I apologize. Here we got off track. Yeah. You have 60 seconds to respond, sir.
You know, again, Congressman Allred did not address his own record, and that's a pattern at every level. You can go to allredfacts.com and you can see his votes. You can see his vote against providing weapons to Israel. You can see the letter Congressman Allred signed. He joined with over 100 left-wing Democrats at the beginning of the Biden administration saying, please send money to Gaza, even though it'll go to Hamas and be used for terrorism. And by the way, I led 19 senators in urging the administration, do not send money to Gaza because it will be used by Hamas for terrorism. We now know how Joe Biden and Kamala Harris resolved that. The administration concluded it was, quote, highly likely that the money would be used by Hamas for terrorism. But you know what they did? They sent it anyway. They waived U.S. anti-terrorism laws. When it comes to records, you know, you didn't hear anything Congressman Allred has done. What I have done is, as I said, authored and passed 101 different pieces of legislation, including legislation targeting Hamas. They should be sanctioned, and I stand with Israel that they should destroy Hamas.
Senator, thank you. Sorry about that just a moment ago as well.